Alright, I know this video is coming a little late, but I got busy and then I got sick and, well, you know the story. So I'm finally getting around to doing this. So this is the Dogmeat model from Modephius' Fallout Wasteland Warfare. So far I primed it in gray. This is one of the PVC models from the base set. One of the things I like about these models is that they have very heavily detailed bases that definitely fit into the Fallout world or any other post-apocalyptic games. Now, one of the things I didn't like about this model is that it's only pegged on the two left legs, so being in PVC and not in resin, it flexes quite easily. Modephius could have easily fixed this by pegging opposing corner legs, but it is what it is. I am choosing to cut it off the base because I think that'll make it easier to paint the underside of the dog. I probably won't do this on future models because it's a lot less necessary, but I feel like since you can see a lot of his underside and he's kind of one of the focus hero characters. So for now, I'll just set the base aside and we'll work on Dogmeat himself. Now, Dogmeat's a German Shepherd, so he's got quite a few ranges of colors from light to dark. This underside is much lighter than the top side, and they have kind of a saddle to them. So the base coat is going to be this leather brown from MSP Reaper paint line, and it's going to look a bit bright on the model at first, but trust me, there is a method to my madness. So the model was primed with a generic gray primer beforehand. Being one of the hero characters, this is cast in a gray plastic. So we're going to pick a fairly large brush for base coating, and always dip a brush in water before you dip it in your paint. That'll prevent the paint from wicking up into the ferrule and ruining your brush. You want it to be damp but not wet once you dip it in the paint. I'm not going to be too careful here. I'm just going to get paint all over it. I will note that at the time of filming I was having some issues with my hands, so I'm a little shakier, a little stabbier with the paint than I normally would be, but for a base coat this isn't a big deal. Just get the paint on. Don't worry if a little bit of the gray shows through. You're going to do a second coat. Try to make sure your coats are even, but they don't have to be perfect. More thin layers is better than one thick layer. If you put on your paint too thick initially, you lose a lot of detail. This depends a bit on the paint. Some paint shrinks down more than others, and if you get a little heavy-handed with it, it won't affect the details as much. These MSP paints tend to fall into that category. But some of the thicker paints, like some of the Citadel paints, they can tend to kind of flood into the details and fill them in a little bit. One way you can actually take advantage of this is to, if you're using thicker paints, let the paints flow heavily into glue seams. If you've had a multi-part model you had to glue together, using green stuff to fill in the cracks would be better, but sometimes the seams are fine enough that a little bit of thick paint will just do the trick. It'll be good enough. One thing I want to say here is that I'm not a master painter by any means. I'm not a professional, but one of the things I want to show through these videos is that painting a miniature, at least to a decent tabletop quality, is not actually that difficult. There's just a few basic techniques you need to use, and once you start combining them in different ways, you will end up with models that look good on the table, will actually impress people. So normally you would mount a model like this to a piece of cork or something as a handle, but I found that his paws are just too small of a contact area to stick them down with hot glue or blue poster tack, or to drill and pin them with a piece of paper clip like I would normally. So for everyone that's pointing out, don't touch the model with your bare fingers, yeah, you're right, but in this case we're going to have to make an exception. So it's already been set aside to dry, and I'm working on the second coat here, just building it up a little bit and filling in some of the areas that I got thin. One thing you can see happening here is that most paints, when you put them down, are slightly darker color than they will dry to be. So this is one of the reasons that I put a drop of paint on the cap of each paint bottle. Or if it's a paint pot, I paint a little bit of the lid. And so you get a much better picture of what the paint's going to look like after it's dried from that than you would from looking through the bottle, especially since a lot of the bottles, like the MSP bottles, are slightly opaque, and it kind of makes a whiter, lighter tint to it, less saturated when you're looking at it through the bottle. So make sure you get every corner and every seam on this. It's real easy to miss the inseams under the legs, underside the head, insides the ears. And once you're fully satisfied with it, set it aside, let it dry again. Letting your paints dry between steps will lead to a lot better paint job in the end. You know, excluding wet blending techniques, things like that. Generally, if you put wet paints on over dry paints, you'll have a much easier time than if your previous layer was slightly damp. You'd be much less likely to lift or blur the colors. So for the next step, we're going to go to a much finer brush and use Dirty Bone. Dirty Bone is a off-white with some kind of gray, really light browns in it. It's, as the name implies, quite often used to do bone and skeletons and stuff like that. But generally when you're painting miniatures, you never want to use a true white. True whites look very, very out of place on a model. So off screen, I have a reference photo of German Shepherd, a couple references of German Shepherds, a couple references of Dogmeat himself. And so what we're doing here is the white highlights that are on the forward areas of the hips and the crotch, and a little bit on the neck. It's okay if you go just a little bit out of bounds towards the center of the body here, because we're going to come back in with a darker color and paint the saddle. So in order to make it look like fur, we don't want a hard edge. We want all of our lines to kind of dither out. The more natural and uneven edges are, the better they'll actually look in the end. This is a little different than when you're painting armor on like your standard character minis, where you want everything to have good, hard, clean edges. On natural fur, like lizard skin textures, things like that, we don't want perfect symmetry. We don't want hard edges. We don't everything to just kind of be smooth and natural. So the less perfect we are, the more perfect the model ends up being in the end. Moving on from painting this, the front light color scheme goes from pretty much one elbow up over the back to the other. At this point, you just kind of freehand it and guess. If you've never done any freehanding work on a model, don't overthink it. Just do it. Worst comes to worst, if you really don't like your results, just paint back over it with the base color and try it again. It's really not that big of a deal. I mean, as thin as these paints are that we use, you have quite a bit of freedom to experiment. And if it goes really bad, look up how to strip a model. It's actually very, very easy to strip the paint off the model and go back and start over again. I know it's a slightly different situation with these models that come in like a starter set or with a board game, but if you're looking for a model to practice with, I would look at the MSP Reaper lines Bones models. They're cast in a white vinyl that's pretty flexible and forgiving, and you can get quite a few of them really cheap, way cheaper than resin or metal models. And if you want to, you could buy like 4 or 5 copies of the same model and just paint each one a different way as a form of practice. As you probably noticed, I kind of screwed up my guess a little bit bringing the line up from the other side. They didn't perfectly meet. But again, that's okay because we're working with something natural here. And so even though the lines didn't perfectly meet, I just kind of dithered out the whole area so that they would match. Also, something I noticed is that the toes on the German Shepherds are always slightly brighter, so we're going to go back and touch up the tips of the toes. Give them some nice white socks. While doing this step, I realized that my handling of the model has caused some of the paint to lift around the ears and the face. And so I've kept a small amount of the original base color on my palette here. I'm just going to go back and touch it up real fast. Unfortunately, while your paints may appear to be dry, if they aren't fully cured, there's a difference between drying to a handleable point and actually being fully cured. Fully cured would take a couple hours to overnight, but they can be handleable within a few seconds to a few minutes depending on the type of paint you're dealing with. This paint is one of the quicker drying ones. It's handleable within a few seconds, but the oils from your fingers will actually lift the paint back off, and that's one of the reasons why it's not recommended that you handle the model directly with your hands like I am here. It's generally much better practice to use some blue poster tack or something like that to glue it down to a cork or to a paint can lid, something that gives you a bigger handle so you're not touching the surface of the model itself and risking damaging your paint. Well, I didn't actually catch the name of it on camera here. We are starting with a much darker brown. This is a very earthy brown, not like a brown you would use for leathers. It has much more of a muddy brown color than your reds based brown that you would use with like leather products. So this color, we are wrapping it around the chest, up over the back, to the inside of these white highlights. And a lot of people call this the saddle, for obvious reasons. And then, once we get this blocked in, we're also going to carry it down the back of the tail a little bit. The back side, or the top side of the tail is very dark, and the underside is fairly light. On this side, we're basically copying it over, doing the exact same thing. Nothing particularly special here. But I did make a mistake, and I got paint on one of the elbows here. So if you keep a couple extra brushes around, you can actually erase a mistake if you do it fast enough. You just need to get your brush wet and go over that area where you made the mistake really quickly, and the wet brush will actually thin it out and start to suck it up, the pigments a little bit. If you use the wet brush to kind of soften up the paint and then quickly wipe the brush out so it's drier and touch it back to that area where you've now thinned the paints, the brush will actually vacuum up the paints and bring the pigments with it. With a little bit of practice, it's actually easy to repair most mistakes. This is, of course, considering that your previous layer was actually dry first. If not, you'll end up picking up both colors immediately. Moving on to the head, chest, and shoulders here. This is where all of my different reference pictures that I picked for the dog start to vary a lot from each other. So this tends to be a lot more unique to the dog. Even in some of the different screenshots that I found from Fallout 4, sometimes the textures were actually different from screenshot to screenshot as to where his face markings are. So, in the end, it's your dog. Paint it how it looks best for you. It's a real easy in this hobby to get caught up on box art or trying to be as realistic as possible to the whatever the original source material is, and in the end, we need to remember that it's our hobby, it's our miniatures, and if you're happy with them, that's all that really matters. I feel it's much more important to be happy with what you put down on the table than it is to be true to the source material. It may not be the case so much with this dog, since this dog is a German Shepherd, but a lot of the other creatures in the sets they're fantasy, and so they can vary a lot, and they should vary a lot. Like for people painting the Deathclaw, a lot of people get a little too focused on trying to paint the Deathclaw exactly like it is on the box or on the game material, but even if you look at the death claws themselves individually, they actually vary quite a bit from death claw to death claw in the game. And so painting a unique skin pattern for them is not necessarily a bad thing. As I got to painting the head here, you probably noticed my strokes got a little less confident. I was trying to decide exactly how I wanted this to turn out. One of the things I noticed that was really common amongst them is to have a mask over their eyes of the lighter base color, while their ears and snout were very dark. So I'm working my way around trying to leave that mask in, almost like a raccoon mask except inverted. Because of how small this miniature actually is, it is almost pointless to try to paint the eyes directly. They're pretty much lost on the model because of his size. He's much more realistic, less heroic scaled than you would find a lot of miniatures, so his eyes are barely a pinpoint. And considering the dog's eyes are dark already, he kind of gets lost in it. So I figured that the mask would draw a little more attention to the face, even though the eyes themselves are barely visible. So moving back to his tail again, as I said before, the tail is very dark down the top, so I painted a stripe down the very center of the tail, and then proceeded to go along the sides and kind of feather it down a little bit, leaving the majority of the sides and the undersides. Also, the closer you get to the tip of the tail, the more dominant the dark color becomes. Flipping them over, we're going to mirror as best as we can, but again, not trying to be perfect. We're going to mirror the darkness of the tail. Again, most concentrated at the tip and fading out towards the back. Double checking a couple spots that I missed. We're going to let that dry. Moving on, we're going to use ebony flesh, which is a very, very dark brown that's bordering on black, but not a pure black. Pure blacks, kind of like pure whites, don't really belong on a miniature. Realistically, if you're painting anything pure black, you should use non-metallic metal techniques, in which case you're not truly painting anything pure black. So pure blacks, pure whites, not really what you want on your miniature. So what we're doing is going in and darkening the dark brown areas and kind of avoiding going up to the edges. I'm just darkening in the central areas of it. I do apologize that I was drifting up out of shot trying to do this. It was very hard to keep focused on it and pay attention to the camera. But as you can see, we're painting in just a bit back from the edge. Layering up, layering darker. The higher points of the saddle on the back, the very top of the backbone, and the top of the neck and the back of the ears especially are the darkest. And then also, we're going to go down the back of the tail. Again, just a little, dropped it there. What I'm doing with my hands here may look a little bit funny, but it actually gives you a lot of stability when you're trying to paint small details. My elbows are locked to the table and my fingers are touching each other, and that stabilizes your hands quite a bit. Especially if you're someone like me who has a little bit of nerve damage in the hands and shakes a bit. We're just kind of going back and kind of inverse highlighting. We're bringing what areas should be the darkest up a little bit darker by using this ebony flesh paint. very front edges of the ears. I didn't worry about the inside so much because I'm actually going to go back and later on bring in another color for that. Now you might be saying to yourself right now that the contrast between these colors is a little too harsh, and you're right. A better technique to use for this would actually be to wet blend or to glaze these colors on so that the transitions are a lot smoother. But in this particular case, I wanted to use a much simpler technique. So in a little bit here, it'll all come together and everything will get toned down, and you'll see why I'm leaving such well-defined edges between colors. This is not necessarily the best way to paint something like this, but it is a lot quicker than the other techniques and a lot easier for a beginner. Going down the ridge of that tail and bringing it around just a little bit, but again trying not to overwhelm the original brown color that I put down. Here I started to go back to the saddle, and at this point this is effectively a second coat as the saddle area has already dried. These layers of paint are fairly thin, so they'll dry within a couple of minutes. Just touching up a few areas that my fingers hit. Again, giving a slight second coat to some areas. Good enough. We're moving on. Now here is the key to pulling this all together. Ignore the drop on the cap. It does not actually look like that in use. So Nuln Oil is a wash. This is not actually a paint. This is more of an ink thinned down with some very slight paint medium, and it's designed to flow really well. It's very watery. So we are just going to slop it on the entire model. Now one of the things about these ink washes is that they are going to soak into the lighter colors a little bit and turn them darker. But their purpose is actually to flow down into all of the little seams and the detail, and this particular model doesn't have a whole lot of really sharply defined fur lines, but on a bigger creature like a bear that would have more sharply defined lines, it drops down into all of the little cracks and recesses and creates shadow. But as a secondary effect, any very light colored paints will soak up a little bit of the pigment and darken down. This is why I wasn't so worried about how bright that original brown that I started with was. This very much starts to bring everything together. Now this is going to take a lot longer to dry, and it needs to be left. And the one thing you want to make sure with these washes is that they don't pool. If they pool, you can dry out your brush a little bit and just touch the spot where it pooled and pick some of it back up. I did leave it to dry for a few minutes, and I'm going back in a second time and darkening the areas a little more that I feel didn't quite take enough ink. These help a lot with giving models a dirty used finish as well. They make the details pop out more, they make everything look worn, and they can be a painter's little dirty secret, so to speak, to make things look better. You can overuse washes. Sometimes if you use too much wash or too dark of a wash, everything just looks dirty and muddled and everything kind of blends together, but that's exactly the effect we want on this dog. We want all these fur colors to look much more cohesive. Washes do take a lot longer to dry than a normal paint, and you really shouldn't try to move on until a wash is completely dry. So give it some time, or use a hair dryer on it to make sure it's 100% dry before you try to paint over it if you're going to continue to paint the model. At this point, we're not going to. I have no more reason to continue to add paint, with the exception of the inner ears and the eyes, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. Now that the second layer of wash is dried, we're going to come back in with this Carnage Red. It's a very dark, often kind of blood red, or like designed for heraldic banners type things. But because it's a darker red, it looks fairly natural inside the ears, because you have, on the actual dog, you have a mix of like flesh tones and fur kind of covering part of it. So this doesn't need to be a very clearly defined bright red. It just needs to have that hint that from a distance gives that natural pinkish tone to the inside of the ears. And it's a little something to bring some attention to the face, because the face is so small in this miniature. As for the eyes, they're just a touch of gloss black. I'm not going to bother to try to white dot the eyes or anything in this case, because they're just simply too small. The only one thing I will do is later on come back and put a drop of high gloss clear coat over the eyes to make them stand out a little more. I'm also coming back in with a black and doing the nose. And again, I will also come back and add a gloss to that. Even though these may seem at the time of painting it to be almost imperceptible details, trust me when I say that our brains are engineered to pick out things that are not right. So these details, although they may be almost lost on this miniature because of how small it is, they do still draw your attention to it. So now we're going to let it completely dry and clear coat it. Now, always use a matte clear coat. I'm going to stress this, and I'm going to stress this again. Always make sure it's a matte clear coat. Don't just buy a generic clear coat and spray it on there and think everything will be okay. It will not. And one of the reasons I stress this is immediately after filming this, I took it outside and I grabbed the wrong can and sprayed Dogmeat with a high gloss clear coat. Here I'm going back and just touching up any little nicks and marks I see that were not quite right before I take it out and spray it. Should you happen to make the mistake of using the wrong clear coat, quite often, say if you use a mid-tone clear coat or like a satin clear coat, you can spray back over the top of it with a matte clear coat, and sometimes it will fix it. In this case, because I used a high gloss, it just wasn't fixable at all. What I'm showing here is a gloss clear coat that I was intending to do the nose and eyes with, but the high gloss tended to outdo that. So stay tuned for part 2, where I'll paint the base and mount Dogmeat to it, and you can see my grand screw up with the high gloss. Stay tuned, I'll be back soon.